Madison Reed was a bright 18-year-old with dreams of becoming a sports journalist. Michael Torres was a respected high school basketball coach twice her age, admired by the community and trusted by parents. What began as a mentorship quickly spiraled into a secret obsession, one fueled by manipulation, control, and hidden threats. As Madison tried to break free from the web Torres had spun around her, the relationship took a deadly turn that would shock an entire town and leave behind haunting questions, a shattered family, and a voice that refused to be silenced. She wanted to write a profile on the Team's turnaround and feature him as the central figure. He helped kids, especially those who were passionate about sports. But something began to change in the tone of their relationship. Madison started dressing differently, more maturely, more carefully. She laughed a little too loudly at his jokes. And Coach Torres began acting more guarded around other staff members when she was nearby, limiting their conversations to brief whispers or moments alone. He agreed without hesitation. That initial conversation led to another. Soon, she was attending practices more often. He paid for her meals, brought her small gifts, and showered her with attention she had never received from anyone. She dropped out of the school newspaper quietly, citing burnout. No one pushed for an explanation. Coach Torres was careful, calculating. He cleared his messages regularly. He kept the relationship hidden, even from those closest to him. Her best friend asked if she was okay and got no real answer. And Coach Torres, once the pride of Meadow Ridge High, had become a shadow lurking in the background of every aspect of Madison's life. She wanted to leave him behind, to expose the truth, but she didn't know how to do it without losing everything. Madison, however, started leaving clues, whether intentionally or subconsciously. A voice memo recorded on her phone, a scribbled journal entry, a discarded necklace he had given her, pieces of a puzzle that, when eventually put together, would reveal everything. It was exciting at first, even thrilling. She felt chosen, special, but that excitement quickly turned into something darker. Nothing physical happened in that moment, but the substitute noted the tension, the flushed faces, the hurried excuses, the too close proximity. She began to understand that what was happening wasn't normal. It wasn't safe. She wanted to end it, but every time she tried, he pulled her back with guilt, with threats, with reminders of how no one would believe her anyway. She felt trapped in a situation she had once walked into willingly. Now, every step forward felt like sinking deeper into quicksand. He mentioned it to the administration, but it was brushed off. Again, she was 18, and Michael Torres had built a career on trust and reputation. No one wanted to believe he could be anything other than what he claimed to be. He became possessive, paranoid, easily angered if she didn't respond quickly to his messages. He wanted to know where she was at all times. He accused her of talking to other boys, of lying about her feelings. She felt the walls closing in, but didn't know how to escape. He began giving her exclusive insights, letting her watch old game footage in his office, and even texting her articles and video clips he thought she'd find useful. She was more distracted at home, glued to her phone, and vague about her whereabouts. What started as mentorship had evolved into secrecy and emotional manipulation. It wasn't love, though she may have thought it was at the time. It was obsession from both ends. Madison saw him as someone who understood her in ways her peers couldn't. He saw her as someone who idolized him and made him feel powerful. The imbalance was obvious, yet both refused to see it. She used to share every detail of her day with her mother, but that openness had vanished. When questioned, she insisted she was just focused on her writing and preparing college applications. But her eyes gave away something else, an anxiousness, a restlessness she couldn't mask. Coach Michael Torres had lived in the small town of Meadow Ridge for over a decade. He wasn't born there, but he was as much a part of the community as the local diner or the town library. Some students noticed that Madison would often leave the journalism room right before Torres' planning period, and wouldn't he return for a while? One janitor recalled seeing the two of them in his office after hours, but nobody reported anything. After all, she was 18, she wasn't technically a minor. And Michael Torres was a trusted figure. Who would question the intentions of a man who had done so much good for the school? People knew him as the man who turned a failing high school basketball team into back-to-back regional champions. At 42 years old, Michael wasn't just a coach, he was a mentor. A role model, a symbol of discipline and leadership. Parents trusted him with their children. School administrators praised him for his dedication, and the students looked up to him, especially those with dreams of playing college ball. He was a fit man with a sharp jawline, always clean-shaven, always wearing a whistle around his neck, even when there was no practice. He had that look in his eye, serious, focused, but approachable. People said he had a way of connecting with students, of listening without judging. What no one knew or dared to suspect was that beneath the surface of this respected public figure was a man capable of something far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. Madison Reed had just turned 18 and was finishing her senior year at Meadow Ridge High. She wasn't on the basketball team, but she was often in the gym, camera in hand, scribbling notes in a little red journal. She wanted to be a sports journalist, inspired by the likes of Erin Andrews and Maria Taylor. Her father had been a football coach before passing away when she was 13, and sports reminded her of him. Her mother worked 2 jobs, so Madison spent a lot of time alone. Ambitious, focused, and intelligent, she knew what she wanted and wasn't afraid to work for it. Coach Torres noticed her one afternoon after practice when she approached him about an interview for the school paper. The interaction seemed innocent at first. Teachers and students saw it as just another example of Michael's mentorship. By late fall, whispers began to circulate. Madison's parents began noticing changes in her behavior. The truth was, Madison and Coach Torres had crossed a line. He began taking her out of town on weekends under the pretense of college scouting trips. At school, they maintained the illusion of distance. Madison began avoiding her friends. She stopped attending events. In December, a substitute teacher accidentally walked in on the 2 of them in the empty gym during a snow day. Madison, however, was starting to see through the facade. The charm had worn off. By the time winter break arrived, she was no longer smiling in photos. Her mother noticed bruises on her arm. And then she disappeared. Madison's disappearance stunned the entire town of Meadow Ridge. On the morning of January 6th, her mother, Karen Reed, knocked on her bedroom door expecting to find her getting ready for school, but the room was empty. The bed looked slept in, the curtains slightly drawn, and her school bag still rested against the wall. Karen told them Madison had been acting strangely in recent weeks. Too early for school, too cold for a stroll. The figure had a hood pulled up, and it was impossible to identify them clearly. The streetlight only caught a glimpse of what appeared to be a male walking behind Madison, keeping pace but never close enough to alarm her, at least not on camera. A few admitted they had noticed Madison and Coach Torres spending a lot of time together. In Madison's room, they found a collection of printed articles about abusive relationships between students and teachers. Hidden in a shoebox under her bed were several voice memos saved to a flash drive. Her laptop had been wiped clean, but the drive held what she apparently wanted to preserve. One student even claimed to have seen them sitting together in his car near a secluded parking lot weeks earlier. The town was on edge. Parents kept their children home from school. He had come in during the early morning hours wearing a hoodie and sunglasses, buying energy drinks, a map, and burner phone credit. The clerk remembered his face and his nervous demeanor. Surveillance footage confirmed the sighting. The media arrived, swarming the town with questions and assumptions. The once quiet community now found itself in the center of a horrifying mystery. Another girl said she once overheard them arguing in the hallway during after-school hours. She had been buried in haste, left alone in the woods where no one would easily find her. The autopsy would later reveal bruises consistent with restraint, a single blow to the head, and traces of her DNA under someone's fingernails, likely evidence of a struggle. The pieces were coming together, and they didn't paint a pretty picture. And the search for Michael Torres became not just about justice, but about delivering closure to a devastated family. Madison had trusted the wrong person. And now, the truth behind their secret relationship had shattered everything. It was now evident that Torres was on the run. He had abandoned his official car and used a rented vehicle under a fake name to escape the growing attention in Meadow Ridge. The manhunt officially began, expanding across state lines. A hiker, traveling through a remote section of woodland just 60 miles from Meadow Ridge, stumbled upon what looked like a disturbed patch of earth. With a sick feeling, he called the police. Cadaver dogs confirmed the worst. She had grown secretive, withdrawn, and more anxious. She wasn't her usual vibrant self. Her classmates distributed flyers, posted to social media, and formed online groups hoping for a lead. A timeline was built, digital records examined, and more footage reviewed. Michael Torres had been smart, but not flawless. His credit card left traces. His burner phone pinged towers. Eventually, all signs pointed toward a cabin property once owned by his late uncle, deep in the Wyoming mountains. The property hadn't been used in years, but utility records showed recent water usage. But underneath the public efforts was a growing sense of dread. The voice memos Madison had left behind weren't the words of someone planning to run away. They were the words of someone fearing the end. Her best friend, Sarah, revealed that Madison had once broken down in tears in the school bathroom, whispering that something was terribly wrong, but refusing to say more. She talked about being followed, monitored, and threatened. No messages, no photos, no personal items connected to Madison. But his personal laptop, which he was known to use for reviewing games and sending team updates, was gone. So was his gym bag and a set of keys normally hung in his office. In one message, she said she wanted to end things with Michael, but he told her it would ruin both of their lives. In another, she admitted she was scared that if she told anyone, he might hurt her or himself. When they arrived, they asked to speak with him. But the staff informed them that Coach Torres had called in sick that morning, something he rarely did. When officers arrived at his house later that day, there was no answer. His car was parked outside, locked, the lights were off. Inside, detectives found a duffel bag that appeared to have been hastily packed and left behind. Inside it were a spare phone charger, some loose cash, an expired passport, and a burner phone. On a small desk drawer, behind a stack of unopened mail, they found a crumpled note that read, "I never meant for it to go this far." It looked like no one had been there all day. Sarah admitted she thought Madison was seeing someone secretly, maybe someone older, but she had no proof. Her car keys were on the dresser, her phone was nowhere to be found. At first, Karen thought maybe she had gone for a walk or to a friend's house early, something unannounced. The last person she had spoken to was Coach Michael Torres. A short 5-minute call. No other texts or calls came after that, but as the minutes turned to hours, worry evolved into panic. By mid-afternoon, she reported Madison missing to the police. Detectives responded quickly, recognizing the urgency of a case involving a young woman. They started by questioning family and friends. Investigators pulled security footage from the neighborhood. One blurry camera across the street captured a figure walking out of the house. Around 5:12 detectives requested access to Madison's phone records, but quickly discovered her main phone hadn't been used since. 10:43 p.m., the night before. The moment the coach's name came up, detectives turned their attention to the high school. With growing suspicion, investigators interviewed several students. Authorities obtained a warrant to search both Madison's bedroom and Michael Torres' office at the school. The voice memos were chilling. Madison spoke in a quiet tone, sometimes trembling, explaining how things had started with compliments and attention, then shifted to manipulation and fear. Meanwhile, the search of Coach Torres' office revealed nothing incriminating. By the next morning, Michael Torres was officially declared a person of interest. His home was searched thoroughly. The search intensified. Drones were deployed over nearby woods. K-9 units were brought in. 3 days into the investigation, a call came in from a gas station clerk in a neighboring county. The clerk recognized Michael Torres from the news reports. Law enforcement traced the purchase and located a highway toll booth where his rental car had passed hours later. As days passed, Madison's family organized vigils and community search events. The FBI joined the investigation. As agents prepared to move in, another discovery sent shockwaves. Underneath the cold soil, wrapped in a tarp, was the body of Madison Reed. The town grieved. The school closed for several days. Candlelight vigils turned into memorials. The news of Madison Reed's death spread quickly, shaking Meadow Ridge to its core. What had begun as a missing person case had turned into a full-blown murder investigation, and the manhunt for Coach Michael Torres reached a fever pitch. Once admired and respected, his name was now synonymous with betrayal and violence. The town was in disbelief. Parents who once praised him were now questioning every moment their children spent under his supervision. Students were angry, heartbroken, and confused. No one could understand how a man so trusted could have committed such a monstrous act. Afterward, he transported her body to a wooded area hours away and buried her in a shallow grave. The level of planning suggested he had thought about this for some time. His quick disappearance, use of aliases, and preparation of supplies all pointed to a man who knew he was about to do something terrible and had no intention of facing the consequences. Investigators now had a new focus, capturing Michael before he disappeared forever. With Madison's body recovered, the evidence against him became overwhelming. People gathered in the town square holding candles and photos of Madison, celebrating the justice they hoped was coming. In his backpack, investigators found a handwritten journal. Inside were disturbing entries, some detailing his obsession with Madison, others outlining his paranoia about getting caught. Madison's voice recordings, the physical evidence, witness testimonies, and Michael's own journal left no room for doubt. The courtroom was packed every day with reporters, students, teachers, and grieving family members in attendance. Michael sat in silence, never speaking, never looking at the Reed family. His defense argued that the relationship had been consensual, that he never meant to hurt her, that it was an accident born of emotional distress. In the end, her own story became one that needed to be told, not just to remember her, but to prevent another tragedy. She had trusted the wrong person. He had taken everything from her, but the voice she left behind made sure the world would never forget her. But the prosecution dismantled every claim with cold, hard facts. He blamed her, blamed the school, blamed the world. Never once did he show remorse. The journal entries confirmed what Madison had tried to tell her voice memos, that this man had spiraled into delusion and saw her as his possession, not a person. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom remained silent as the sentence was read. No cheers, no celebration, only a heavy collective breath released by a community that had endured far too much. Her parents were seen standing quietly among the crowd, holding each other, emotionally drained. For them, closure would never truly come. Meadow Ridge High underwent major changes. New leadership was installed, policies were rewritten, and programs were created to protect students and encourage them to speak up. A scholarship was established in Madison's name for young women pursuing journalism. Her mother, though broken, became an advocate for victims of teacher-student abuse, traveling across the state to share her daughter's story. But knowing Michael Torres was finally in custody meant the first step toward healing could begin. In it, she said she feared for her life and felt like she was being hunted by someone she once admired. Her voice shook, but her words were clear. That recording, more than anything else, reminded everyone that she had seen what was coming but couldn't escape it. They described him as calculating, emotionally manipulative, and likely desperate. He had financial resources, knowledge of rural areas, and no close family ties left to track. His only weakness might be his need to remain in control, which often leads fugitives to make mistakes. Agents believed he would avoid major cities and stick to places he knew from past road trips or family visits. Forensic experts discovered traces of Michael's DNA under Madison's fingernails, suggesting a violent struggle before her death. The footage showed him wearing a beanie, sunglasses, and a thick beard, clearly trying to alter his appearance. He paid in cash and left quickly. Authorities canvassed the area and discovered a rundown cabin about 30 miles outside town that had been in his late uncle's name. A local hardware store employee remembered a man buying propane and supplies 2 days earlier, again all in cash. The burner phone found in his home had been used to contact only one number, an old acquaintance from his college days living out west. When they finally moved, they found Michael inside, half asleep near a wood-burning stove. He was alone, unarmed, and didn't resist arrest. It was a quiet end to a violent story. Around 10:43 p.m., she spoke to Michael on the phone. Investigators believe that was when he manipulated her into meeting him one last time, possibly under the pretense of closure or to return something she had left with him. At approximately 5:12, she left the house. Cameras caught a hooded figure walking behind her at a distance. That figure was likely Michael, lying in wait. That man told authorities Michael had reached out weeks earlier asking for help, getting away for a while, claiming he was going through personal turmoil. The man refused, sensing something wasn't right. That call became another thread in the unraveling story of Michael's attempt to vanish. Bruising on her arms and wrists indicated she had been restrained. The blow to her head was fatal, delivered with something blunt, likely in a moment of rage. The tarp she was wrapped in was traced back to a hardware store in Meadow Ridge. Surveillance footage later confirmed Michael had purchased the tarp, gloves, and rope just days before Madison vanished. The investigation moved quickly. Phone records showed he had switched off his main phone around midnight the night Madison disappeared. Detectives reconstructed the timeline. On the night of January 5th, Madison had told her mother she was going to bed early. What happened next wasn't entirely known, but the evidence suggested he forced her into his vehicle, drove her to a secluded location, and murdered her during an argument. With the FBI leading the search, a profile of Michael Torres was developed. A breakthrough came when a surveillance camera captured a man matching Michael's description purchasing groceries in a remote Wyoming town. Federal agents prepared to move in. The surrounding area was rugged and snow-covered, making an approach difficult. They waited until nightfall, surrounding the cabin silently. Back in Meadow Ridge, the news of his capture brought both relief and pain. In the days following the arrest, new details emerged. The trial was scheduled for later that year, and the state prepared a strong case. The most haunting moment came when the jury heard Madison's voice, played aloud from one of her final recordings. After a lengthy trial, Michael Torres was found guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, unlawful sexual relationship with a student, kidnapping, and obstruction of justice. Though justice had been served, the damage could not be undone. Madison Reed had dreams of telling stories, of writing the truth. The courtroom was a place of quiet agony. For weeks, Madison Reed's family sat in the same front-row seats, listening to every witness, every forensic expert, every chilling detail laid out by the prosecution. Her mother, Karen, never spoke to the press, never reacted during the trial, but her eyes remained locked on Michael Torres from the moment he entered until the judge dismissed court each day. Michael rarely looked back, and that the tragedy was the result of a mental breakdown, not premeditation. His voice was soft, barely above a whisper. He claimed he had loved Madison, that he had made mistakes, but insisted he never meant to harm her. He said he didn't remember parts of that night clearly. He described feeling like someone else had taken over. But no matter how many times he spoke of regret, the evidence remained unmoved by his emotionless face and rehearsed words. They argued that he had snapped, overwhelmed by guilt and fear of exposure. Former students started coming forward, revealing that Madison hadn't been the first girl to receive special attention. Some recounted being uncomfortable around him. Others remembered odd conversations or uninvited comments. There was never enough to report, never enough to prove, but in hindsight, the signs had been there. The school district launched an internal investigation, placing multiple staff members on leave. A new training program for educators and students was introduced, focusing on boundaries, consent, and reporting abuse. His name is forgotten by most, mentioned only in cautionary tales. Not just as a girl who was taken too soon, but as a voice that still speaks, warning others, protecting others, and making sure her silence wasn't the end. His legacy, once tied to trophies and championships, is now permanently linked to manipulation and murder. They tried to reframe the events as a tragic accident during an emotionally charged confrontation. But the facts didn't support that version. But as a young woman who had loved sports and dreamed of telling stories, it aimed to educate parents, teachers, and teens about grooming, emotional manipulation, and power dynamics in student-teacher relationships. They traveled across the state speaking at schools and conferences. Karen found strength in advocacy, channeling her grief into change, making sure that what happened to Madison would serve as a warning to others. A mural of her, smiling with a camera around her neck, was painted near the entrance. But for the people who lived through it, the wound remained fresh. Madison's name was etched into the town's identity. She had trusted someone who wore a mask of kindness, and in return, he took her life. Students left notes and flowers below it in the weeks following the trial. The burner phone, the purchased items, the burial site, the attempt to flee all told a different story. The judge addressed him directly, saying his actions had destroyed lives and betrayed a sacred trust. Michael said nothing. He was escorted out in silence, eyes downcast, his future sealed by the weight of what he had done. Her story has been shared on documentaries, podcasts, and panels. She became a symbol not of tragedy alone, but of resilience, of speaking up, of leaving behind a voice that could not be silenced. A story of control, manipulation, and ultimate violence. He sat motionless in his seat, dressed in a suit a size too big, his once carefully maintained appearance now a ghost of what it had been during his coaching days. His hair had grown wild, his face gaunt, and his hands trembled slightly every time he lifted a pen. She had seen the bruises, the unease, the late nights, the change in Madison's spirit. When the verdict was read guilty on all counts, there was no audible reaction. Only the sound of Karen quietly exhaling, her eyes closing for a moment as if to say, "Finally." She had known something was wrong, and now she would carry that guilt for the rest of her life. The prosecution began methodically, laying out the foundation of the case with clinical precision. They presented the timeline of Madison's disappearance, the evidence recovered from her body, and the purchase records of the items used in the cover-up. The bruising pattern on her arms matched the force of someone attempting to restrain her. Played in full for the court, Madison's memos painted a portrait of fear, confusion, and desperation. In one, her voice cracked as she described Michael following her, showing up unexpectedly and making veiled threats. In another, she confessed that she no longer felt safe and was terrified that if she ended things, he would lose control. These recordings were more than just emotional testimony, they were a warning Madison had tried to leave behind. The jury heard her voice from beyond the grave, and it carried more weight than any witness ever could. The blunt force trauma that caused her death was not consistent with an accident, it had been delivered with intent. Photos were displayed to the jury in hushed horror. The courtroom sat in tense silence as the images of Madison's final moments, reconstructed from forensic data, revealed the brutal nature of what had happened. The tarp, the gloves, the rope, it was all cataloged and traced back to Michael Torres. Surveillance footage was shown to the jury, clearly placing him at multiple locations crucial to the investigation. There was no ambiguity. Then came the forensic analysis. DNA experts took the stand, confirming that Michael's skin cells had been found under Madison's fingernails. But it was the voice recordings that cast the darkest shadow. Michael's defense was feeble by comparison. His attorney claimed that the relationship had been consensual, that Madison had initiated much of the contact. When Michael finally took the stand, the courtroom held its breath. Karen Reed left the courtroom every time Michael testified. She couldn't bear to hear him speak of love when her daughter had spoken of fear. The jury deliberated for 2 days. The town waited, the media camped outside the courthouse, and students at Meadow Ridge High held a silent vigil. Michael Torres was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. After the trial, the town began to reckon with the reality of who Michael Torres truly was. The high school gymnasium was renamed the Madison Reed Memorial Court, an effort to remember her not as a victim. Karen and her husband Thomas established the Voices of Madison Foundation. In time, the media moved on. The reporters left Meadow Ridge. New scandals emerged elsewhere. Even years later, her voice recordings are played in classrooms as part of awareness training. Coach Michael Torres sits in a maximum security prison, serving his sentence in solitude. He receives no visitors, no letters. But Madison's story lives on. The years after Michael Torres' conviction passed slowly for the town of Meadow Ridge. Though the legal chapter had closed, the emotional damage lingered. The town that had once taken pride in its quiet streets, championship banners, and tight-knit school community was now haunted by the memory of a young girl who had trusted too easily and a man who had deceived everyone around him. Madison Reed's name never faded from public memory. Her voice recordings continued to be used in trainings for educators, police officers, and advocacy groups. They became tools of awareness, examples of how easily manipulation can hide behind charm, authority, and trust. At first, their involvement was limited to local events and fundraisers, but over time their reach expanded. More than once, the school intervened early in situations that could have turned dangerous. Teachers became more alert, students more aware. Madison had unknowingly saved lives through her story. They began speaking at national conferences, addressing school boards, and working with lawmakers to push for stronger protections against teacher-student misconduct. At graduation, they left one seat empty on the front row with her name stitched into the fabric. It had become a peaceful place over the years, covered in blooming wildflowers during spring and quiet snow in winter. She wrote that she wanted to believe people were good, that trust should be something safe. She made sure her story would not vanish with her. They mentor younger students. Madison's story gave them permission to talk about things they used to hide. Not as a victim, not as a tragic figure, but as a symbol of courage. Her story was no longer about what was taken from her, it was about what she gave in return. Awareness, change, and the echo of a voice that refused to be forgotten. The silence that once surrounded taboo subjects in Meadow Ridge had been broken irreversibly. She didn't just warn the world, she educated it. She turned her pain into a legacy that reshaped policies, opened eyes, and changed lives. But she also warned that sometimes those who smile the widest are hiding the deepest harm. That letter, now preserved in a glass case at the local library, ends with the line, "If anything ever happens to me, just know I tried to be brave." And every time someone listened to her recordings, read her letters, or learned from her story, Madison won. Her voice had power. Her voice had purpose. And it was heard louder than ever, long after she was gone. A bench had been placed nearby with a plaque that read, "Her voice made a difference." Karen sat there often, sometimes alone, sometimes with Thomas, sometimes with other parents who had lost children under similar circumstances. It had become more than a grave, it had become a symbol of awareness and change. A white rose rested on the chair, and when her name was called during the ceremony, the entire class stood in silence. It was their way of saying goodbye. It was their way of reminding the world that she was part of them, even in absence. The high school hired a new principal and brought in a counseling team trained in trauma and abuse prevention. Titled "Her Voice Wasn't Silent," it combined interviews with law enforcement, legal experts, classmates, and Madison's family. He was kept in protective custody due to the nature of his crime. He rarely spoke to anyone and never granted interviews. Psychologists who evaluated him described him as cold, detached, and unrepentant. He never apologized, never expressed genuine remorse. He lived in silence, much like the one he had once tried to force upon Madison, but she had spoken, and he could never undo that. The documentary didn't just focus on the crime, it focused on how such abuse can unfold in plain sight, how predators use their positions of power, and how institutions often miss the signs until it's too late. It was widely viewed and praised for its sensitivity and depth. More importantly, it became a part of training materials in schools across the country. New policies required teachers to log all after-hours interactions with students. All staff members underwent mandatory annual training on boundaries and reporting suspicious behavior. A 24-hour anonymous tip line was established for students to report concerns. Karen, once a shy woman who kept to herself, became a passionate advocate. She learned to speak clearly, directly, even when her voice trembled. People listened, not just because of her pain, but because of her clarity and her conviction. Students across the state listened to her words in school assemblies, her fear, her uncertainty, her quiet warnings. Though she was gone, she was still speaking. Her parents, Karen and Thomas Reed, found a sense of purpose in the Voices of Madison Foundation. In one particularly powerful moment, Karen stood in front of a room full of educators at a national training seminar and played one of Madison's final recordings. It was the memo in which Madison said she didn't know how to escape the situation she was in, that she was scared her voice would be ignored. When the recording ended, there wasn't a single dry eye in the room. Karen didn't say much afterward, she didn't need to. Madison's words said enough. Back in Meadow Ridge, changes were slowly made to rebuild trust. Students, once hesitant to speak openly, began to feel safer. One of the most touching tributes came from Madison's classmates the year after her death. Years later, a documentary was made about the case. Michael Torres, meanwhile, remained in prison. One winter afternoon, Karen visited the spot where Madison was buried. In the final letter Madison had written, one that was never sent and was found tucked into the back of her red journal, she wrote about how confused she felt. And she was brave, braver than anyone realized. In her quiet moments of fear, she documented everything. The students who once whispered about the rumors now speak openly about safety, consent, and boundaries. They form peer support groups. As time moved forward, Madison's name continued to be spoken. Coach Michael Torres may have controlled her in life, but he could not silence her in death.